The story starts at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where a professor named Gerald Lambeau is teaching a math class. At the end of his lecture, he tells his graduate students that he's going to put a very tough math problem on the board outside the classroom, and whoever solves it will have their name published in the MIT Tech. He encourages his students by mentioning that top mathematicians have solved such problems before. Due to its difficulty, Professor Gerald gives them until the end of the semester to solve it. After the lecture, we see Will Hunting, a janitor at MIT, looking at the math problem written by Professor Gerald. Will later goes home and attempts to solve the equation on his bathroom mirror. The next day, when he's alone in the hallway, he takes a piece of chalk and writes the solution to the problem that Professor Gerald had assigned to his students. Outside of work, Will spends his time drinking and hanging out with his friends Chucky, Billy, and Morgan. One day, while watching a kid's baseball game, Will spots a guy who used to bully him at school. Later, he and his friends approach the guy and start a fight. Will ends up beating the bully badly until his friends pull him away. When the police try to restrain him, he attacks an officer, which leads to his arrest. Meanwhile, Professor Gerald is informed by his students that the math problem has been solved. He rushes to check and sees that someone indeed solved it. He asks his students if any of them did it, but no one admits to it, leaving him puzzled. His next class is crowded with people eager to find out who the mysterious math genius is. Professor Gerald asks the solver to come forward and claim their prize, but no one steps up. With no one claiming the solution, Professor Gerald tells his students that he has written another difficult math problem that took him 2 years to solve. Not knowing who the anonymous solver is, he has set a new challenge. Will, after getting out of jail, immediately works on solving the new problem. Meanwhile, Professor Gerald comes out of his office and sees Will writing on the board. Thinking Will is vandalizing it, he confronts him. Will runs away, but later, Professor Gerald sees that Will had actually solved the problem that took him 2 years to solve. He now knows who the mysterious genius is. After work, Will meets his friends at a bar. Chucky starts flirting with some attractive women and lies that he's in the same class as them. A man interrupts and asks which class he means, and Chucky says history. The man, who knows Chucky is lying, tries to embarrass him by asking about historical topics. Chucky remains silent, so Will steps in and starts debating the man, stating facts and his own opinions. The man tries to counter, but Will finishes his sentence and calls him out for reciting a passage from a book. Will mocks the man for spending thousands of dollars on an education he could have gotten for free at a public library. Embarrassed, the man walks away. Later, one of the women, named Skylar, approaches Will and gives him her phone number, impressed by his intelligence. She asks him to call her so they can go out for drinks sometime. Will proudly shows off the number to the guy who tried to act smart. Meanwhile, Professor Gerald is looking for the janitor who solved his challenging math problems. After asking around, he finally gets Will's contact information. He shows up at Will's court hearing for assaulting a police officer. Will defends himself, but the judge notes his history of petty theft and assaults. The judge says he can ignore Will's past and sentences him to jail with a $50,000 bail. Will gets sent to prison, but there he meets Professor Gerald, who has a proposition for him. He tells Will that he has spoken with the judge and is willing to get him released, but Will must agree to 2 conditions. The first is that Will takes math classes with Professor Gerald, and the second is that he gets counseling. Will laughs at the idea of seeing a therapist, but to avoid jail, he has no choice but to agree. He soon starts taking math classes with Professor Gerald, who is amazed and proud of Will's intelligence. Next, he needs to see a therapist. Despite visiting many, Will refuses to open up and mocks them instead. He reads their books the night before and ridicules them during sessions. As a last attempt, Professor Gerald turns to his old friend Sean McGuire, who now teaches psychology at a community college, for help. At first, Sean says he's too busy, but Professor Gerald insists, explaining that Will is a genius and that Sean's counseling could help him reach his potential. Sean eventually agrees and meets with Will. In their first session, Sean asks Professor Gerald and his assistant to leave the room. Just as he did with the other therapists, Will mocks Sean's book collection. Sean recognizes this as a defense mechanism and remains calm, engaging in casual conversation without probing into Will's life. Will notices a painting by Sean and, quoting art books, makes wrong assumptions about Sean's life. Sean stays composed, but when Will brings up Sean's wife, Sean gets visibly irritated. Realizing he hit a nerve, Will keeps talking about her, asking if she cheated on him. Sean loses his temper, grabs Will by the throat, and warns him never to disrespect his wife. Will then declares the session over, and Sean lets him go. Will leaves, thinking he has once again bested a therapist. Professor Gerald assumes Sean won't want to continue with Will, but to his surprise, Sean asks to continue sessions next week. After the session, Will goes on a date with Skylar, discovering she comes from a wealthy family and studies at Harvard. They hit it off and share a kiss to end the night. The following week, Will returns to Sean's office. Sean takes him to a park, explaining that he thought about what Will said about his painting and realized Will is just a kid who doesn't know what he's talking about. Sean tells Will that, just as one can't understand someone's life from a few books, he can't grasp Will's issues from a psychology degree alone. Sean understands Will's fear of speaking out but tells him that eventually, he'll need to talk to truly live his life. Will resumes his routine, with his friend Chucky driving him to their construction job. He tries calling Skylar but hesitates. In their third session, neither Will nor Sean speaks a word for the entire hour. The fourth session starts similarly, with Will staying silent until he finally tells Sean a joke out of boredom. Seizing the opportunity, Sean asks if Will has a girlfriend. Will mentions Skylar and admits he hasn't contacted her since their first date, feeling she's too good for him and fearing he'll mess things up. Sean tells him that no one is perfect, and what matters is if someone is perfect for you. To illustrate, Sean shares how his wife, whom he loved dearly, used to fart in her sleep. This breaks the tension, and both Sean and Will laugh heartily. They grow closer, and Will starts feeling more at ease with Sean. The session ends with Sean advising Will not to think Skylar is too good for him but to consider if they'll be happy together. Deep in thought, Will has to be reminded the session is over. Motivated by Sean's advice, Will goes to Skylar's dorm and asks her out again. She agrees but says she has a tough problem to solve, which could take hours or days. Impatient to see her, Will solves the problem on a napkin and gives it to her. With no more obstacles, they head out for their second date. Skylar asks about Will's family, and he lies, saying he has 12 brothers. She asks for their names, and Will provides 12 random names. When Skylar asks him to repeat them, he does so perfectly, showcasing his genius. He sees Sean at his next therapy session and asks if Sean ever regretted meeting his wife, considering the immense pain he felt after she passed away. In response, Sean shares the story of how he met her. He recounts first seeing her while standing in line with friends to buy tickets for a legendary baseball game. Will gets excited, thinking Sean watched the game live rather than on TV. He inquires about the experience, and Sean vividly describes the game's events. However, Sean then reveals he watched it later on TV because he left his friends to go on a date with a girl he had just met, who would become his wife. Will is stunned that Sean chose to miss a historic game just to spend time with a girl. Addressing Will's initial question, Sean says he has never regretted missing that game and certainly has no regrets about meeting his wife and having her in his life, even if it was brief. Meanwhile, Skylar asks Will to introduce her to his friends and family. Though Will is still lying to her about his life, he reluctantly agrees to introduce her to his friends. Skylar, Will, and his friends meet at a bar, and Skylar hits it off with them, enjoying herself and making everyone laugh with her jokes. At the same time, Professor Gerald asks Sean about Will's progress. Sean reports that Will is slowly opening up but needs more time to feel comfortable enough to talk about his life and his fear of trusting others. Professor Gerald mentions he's setting up job interviews for Will at top math institutes, believing that once Will overcomes his mental hurdles, nothing will stop him from excelling in the field. Sean argues they shouldn't make life decisions for Will but should support his choices. However, Professor Gerald insists he won't let Will's talent go to waste. Will, not wanting such a job, sends his friend Chucky to the interview instead. One night, while discussing their lives, Skylar asks Will to move to California with her. Will panics and says he can't go with her. Skylar questions why he's afraid of commitment and why he never tells her the truth, bringing up his lie about having 12 brothers. Being called a liar, Will loses his temper and reveals that he was an orphan who bounced from one foster home to another and was abused by his foster father. Skylar cries and says she wants to be with him and help him, but Will pushes her away, insisting he doesn't need anyone's help. It becomes evident that Will fears abandonment, believing that anyone he loves will eventually leave him. Skylar tearfully insists she loves him and won't leave, but Will lies, saying he doesn't love her back, and leaves, leaving Skylar in tears. After pressure from Professor Gerald, Will agrees to a job interview. He shows up but makes no real effort to get the job. In his therapy session with Sean, Will is asked who he trusts the most. He answers, Chucky. Sean acknowledges that while Chucky would do anything for Will, he might not fully grasp Will's deep emotions. Sean asks Will how he plans to make a living. Will replies that he will work as a construction worker in Boston for the rest of his life. Sean challenges Will, saying he's afraid to leave his comfort zone. which will prevent him from living his best life. Sean doesn't force Will to take the job Professor Gerald has lined up for him, but he asks what Will truly wants to do with his life. Will jokingly says he wants to be a shepherd. Realizing Will isn't serious, Sean asks him to leave, not wanting to waste his time if Will won't be honest. Will gets angry and yells at Sean, who again asks what he wants to do with his life. Will stays silent, so Sean tells him to go. Before Skylar leaves for California, Will calls to say goodbye. Skylar, hoping to reconcile, tells Will she loves him. Will smiles but can't say it back, afraid of getting hurt. Talking with Chucky, Will says he doesn't plan to get a job and has broken up with Skylar. When Chucky asks what he wants to do, Will says he plans to stay in Boston, be neighbors with Chucky, and work construction with him. Chucky, being honest, tells Will it's painful to see him waste his potential when he could achieve so much more. Chucky says he wishes every day that Will isn't there when he comes to pick him up, hoping Will leave his current life and find something meaningful. Meanwhile, Professor Gerald argues with Sean about why he hasn't convinced Will to use his intelligence and get a good job. Sean argues that they shouldn't rush Will into making life decisions when he's unsure what he wants. He explains that Will fears abandonment and pushes people away before getting too close. Sean believes they should support whatever Will wants to do and not force him into a job he might hate, but Professor Gerald disagrees. Their differing views lead to a heated argument, with Gerald accusing Sean of being jealous of his success. Sean retorts that he's not a failure for choosing a different path. At that moment, Will walks in and hears their argument. Gerald leaves to let the therapy session begin. Sean shows Will pictures of his bruised body from beatings by his foster father. Will asks if Sean has seen anything like it before. Sean reveals his father was an alcoholic who beat him and his mother. Hearing this, Will recalls his own foster father. Sean steps in front of Will and tells him it wasn't his fault. Will nods, but Sean repeats it wasn't his fault. Will insists he knows, but Sean keeps repeating it until Will breaks down in tears and pushes Sean away. Sean repeats that the abuse wasn't Will's fault. Will finally breaks down, hugs Sean, and cries, ready to move on from his past. He tells Sean he's going to take one of the jobs Gerald set up for him. Their final therapy session ends, and Will asks if they can stay in touch. Sean says he'll always be there and tells Will to follow his heart. Will hugs Sean and says goodbye. For his 21st birthday, Chucky, Billy, and Morgan give him a car. It's not new, but Will appreciates it as a gift from his best friends. Meanwhile, Gerald apologizes to Sean for their argument, and they reconcile. Sean tells Gerald he's going on a world tour. While packing, Will drives up to Sean's house and watches him get ready. Will leaves a letter in Sean's mailbox before driving away. Chucky goes to pick up Will but gets no answer at the door. He peeks in and sees Will isn't home. Chucky smiles, realizing Will has finally decided what he wants to do. Sean finds Will's letter, saying he's not taking the job and is going to California to see Skylar. Sean smiles and goes back inside. The movie ends with Will on his way to reunite with Skylar. Turn on alerts, like, and subscribe for more videos similar to this one. Thank you for watching.